Well, welcome to today's webinar from the Center for Ag Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Brad Lubin. I'm an Extension Policy Specialist here in the Department of Agricultural Economics and working in the Center for Ag Profitability. I invite you to find a variety of farm and ranch management information and tools and resources on our center's website. That's cap.unl.edu, cap.unl.edu. Today, we're focusing on a better understanding of the ethanol market. The ethanol industry has been a major source of demand for U.S. corn over the past 2 decades, following the renewable fuels legislation passed in 2005 and 2007. Ethanol production has expanded rapidly. It's become an important component, and it is a source of both opportunity and maybe uncertainty here looking ahead. Well, the sector has matured, obviously, since those early years of growth. Regulatory decisions, tax incentives, potential new market opportunities, and other challenges continue to influence ethanol production and its role in the broader ag markets. Today, our speaker, Dr. Scott Irwin, will give us a fundamental story, give us the story at least of the fundamental supply and demand forces shaping the ethanol market and the policy and market developments that could influence the sector moving forward. As we go through today's webinar, remember you can ask questions anytime by posting them in the Q&A section of your Zoom window. We will take questions as you go, and then we will moderate them after our guest has had an opportunity to present his information. So we invite your questions. Please type them in as you have them, and we will get to them before the end of our session today. So with that, I do get the privilege of introducing a longtime friend. I would say an old friend, but I don't like to use the term old, Scott, so we'll just say longtime friend. But a longtime friend, Dr. Scott Irwin. Scott is a professor and the Laurence Norton Chair of Ag Marketing in the Department of Ag and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois. Scott is widely known for his research and analysis in ag commodity markets. He's the author of a great book I recall calling Back to the Futures. Amongst other things, he's an expert in biofuels, understanding the policy and economics of the industry, with a focus today on the ethanol industry particularly. So with that, Scott, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your insight and look forward to the discussion. You're sharing your presentation here, and we'll be ready to go.
Well, thank you very much, Brad. It's always great to work with you and reconnect. And I expect there's a little excitement on campus about the Husker basketball team these days.
Absolutely.
So that's a fun story. Well, let me get right to it. I'm just going to confirm with you, Brad, that everything is going in the share as it should.
It looks good, Scott.
Okay, great. So just a little of an overview of what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to be delving into basically the economic and policy drivers of the U.S. ethanol market and how those may evolve in the next few years. Okay, so that's kind of the perspective rather than really short term. So I want to start with a key factor for understanding the U.S. ethanol market. It's the E10 blend wall. And I suspect that most people in our audience today have probably heard of it, but may not know why it's there. You have to go all the way back to the 1980s to the U.S. Clean Air Act amendments, when the limit of 10% of gasoline blends containing ethanol by volume was first put into effect. And we'll get into some changes there a little bit later in my remarks. What I want to show in this chart is that we approached that E10 blend wall, which is 10% of U.S. gasoline volume, around 2011. And as the chart shows very clearly, ever since it's been agonizingly slow progress in breaking through the E10 blend wall. And again, I'll talk a little bit later about some of those reasons. Now, that's not to say that no progress has been made. It's not a 100% cap on ethanol because we've had a lot of effort put into expanding higher ethanol blends like E85 first, and now the focus is on E15. And again, some progress has been made. In 2025, the blend percentage in the US was 10.5%. So that's a half a percent above the 10% blend wall. But on the other side, that's exactly the same blending percentage as we had in 2025. So despite the overall picture of progress in increasing the consumption of those higher ethanol blends, we've really been pretty flat in recent years. The implication of the E10 blend wall is that domestic ethanol demand in the US is set by US gasoline demand. You can simply take whatever you project for gasoline demand right now, multiply it by 10.5%, and there you go. That's going to be a very accurate prediction of US ethanol demand. So to project ethanol demand, the really important variable to predict is US gasoline demand. And as you can see from this chart, it's been a wild ride since 2005. It was so easy back in the 1990s and early 2000s. US gasoline demand, just like clockwork, went up about a little over 2 billion gallons a year. Then we saw the dramatic increase in crude oil prices back in 07, 08, the Great Recession, then higher crude oil prices, and then COVID. And so it's been all over the map. Since COVID, we've seen a recovery to around 137 billion gallons, but 2025 has tilted down again. So this is really the key question for the immediate future of the US ethanol industry is where is gasoline use in the United States headed? And to answer that question, we have to talk about EVs. And of course, we have the most prominent manufacturer of battery electric vehicles, Tesla, Elon Musk, standing on the left in this picture. But before we get into any details, it is really important to define what we mean by EV, or electric vehicle. It turns out that there are actually three major categories of EVs. The first goes by the acronym BEV, or battery electric vehicle, powered 100% by electric motors. The second kind is an HEV, or hybrid electric vehicle, and that's powered by a combination of an electric motor and an internal combustion engine, which goes by the acronym ICE. And the third category is PHEV, or plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. And a PHV is simply a hybrid with a bigger battery that can be charged externally. Hybrids don't have any external charging. The electricity is generated by something called regenerative braking. Really quite a remarkable technology. So properly understood, when you use the word EV, you really mean the combination of all three of these different kinds of electric vehicles. Here's my main thesis with regard to the EV transition. All of the attention tends to be on BEVs, when what we should be watching here, especially in the Corn Belt, is what's happening with the hybrids. Because there's some really simple arithmetic. Basically, in terms of lost gasoline demand, two new hybrids, shown on the right in the chart, approximately equals the lost gasoline demand from one BEV. Or as the way I like to put it, the gasoline demand loss for two new Toyota hybrids is about the same as one new Tesla. And it's just easy to forget that the new hybrids, especially, are remarkably more fuel efficient than their ICE versions. Basically, a new hybrid gets about at least 40 to 45% better gas mileage than the comparable ICE version of the same model. And that has really important implications that I'm going to argue going forward. So just quickly, I want to take you through some projections of where these different kinds of EVs and ICE vehicles are going in the next decade. What I'm showing in this chart is the last official long-term projection of new car sales through 2035 under the Biden administration. This goes by something called the AEO 2025 projections. And so in this chart, the scale adds up to 100%. It goes through 2035. Red represents the percentage of battery electric vehicles that are projected to be sold. Green is hybrids. The pink is PHEVs, and the blue are traditional ICE gasoline vehicles. And you can see that the official US projection showed a huge increase in new BEV sales going forward. Basically, getting over 50% of new car sales by 2032, which is not that far away. For a number of reasons, I think this scenario is highly unlikely to occur. There's a number of headwinds facing battery electric vehicle adoption. These include losing the tax credit in last summer's Big Beautiful Bill for battery electric vehicles, a variety of consumer concerns and hurdles like charging time, electricity costs, range. We could go through those. And so I don't think that these are realistic. This is a set of projections that I've put together with a colleague that I'm working on this project with, Todd Hubbs at Oklahoma State. And this is our collective wisdom about what we think are represent a much more realistic rate of adoption in terms of new light-duty vehicle sales through 2035. And what you can see, we think there will be growth in BEVs, but it'll be dramatically slower than that forecast that you just saw, and that the sweet spot is going to be hybrids. And we have those going over 40% by 2035, also some nice growth in the plug-in hybrids. But a key thing is there are just some vehicles, ICE vehicles, like large SUVs and trucks that are not going to transition even to hybrids really quickly. So we think at least a third of the market a decade from now will still be ICE gasoline vehicles. So what Todd and I did is we built a little simulation model to plug these different scenarios in and evaluate what is the ultimate impact on the demand for ethanol as we look out over the next decade. And it is important. A key assumption in this analysis is that the ethanol blend rate stays fixed at 10.5%. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. So here's what we came up with under these two scenarios. So the official government AEO 2025, if you believed that set of projections for new car sales, new vehicle sales, I should say, because it's light duty vehicles, cars and trucks, we would lose over 2 billion gallons of ethanol demand by 2035. That would obviously be a big hit. Not nearly as scary of a decline under our hybrid leaning scenario, which is called constrained here. But you would still lose about 650 million gallons of ethanol demand as we go out to 2035. To me, you can argue about which scenario is really correct, but the message to Corn Belt agriculture and the U.S. corn ethanol industry is pretty straightforward at this point. And it is that the U.S. domestic ethanol market is going to shrink over the next decade. The only real argument, in my view, is how big is the demand loss going to be, not whether there will be a demand loss. And it's really going to probably pick up starting around 2030 when all these hybrids really start beginning to dominate the inventory of light duty vehicles. The only way I see this as being wrong is if Americans start driving a lot more. And there really isn't any evidence that driving habits change that quickly. So the big question is, how can the U.S. ethanol industry respond? Basically, there are three options. The expansion of domestic use via E15, basically capture a larger share of a shrinking market. Increase exports to the rest of the world. Or find new markets such as SAF or sustainable aviation fuel. And I'm going to talk about all three of these in the next few minutes. So let's start by talking about E15, which gets a lot of headlines these days, rightfully so. There are some positive factors as we look at the potential for E15 moving forward. In 2011, the EPA approved EPA for use in model year 2001 and newer light-duty vehicles. So, here we are. That's almost 25 years of model years of light-duty vehicles that can use E15 legally now. So that's the vast majority of the fleet. Current D6 RIN prices of around $1.40 a gallon incentivize E15 pricing that should be competitive with E10 on a miles per gallon basis. Basically, here's the issue. There's roughly a 1.5% to 2% decline in gas mileage associated with E15 compared to E10. And E10 is the base because almost every gallon of gasoline used in the US now contains at least 10% ethanol. And drivers, we expect, will demand compensation for that decline in gas mileage. The good news is high RIN prices are the vehicle for doing that. So that's good news. If you want to know what that penalty, what that discount needs to be, at a 1.7% hit for gas mileage and $3 pump price of gasoline, regular gasoline, you need E15 to be discounted at least a nickel to offset the drop in mileage. And the good news is that very high D6 RIN prices more than do that job. California approved E15 last October, so it's now legal in all 50 states. And there's modest conversion costs for retail gas stations if they're already offering E10 and they want to switch entirely from E10 to E15 pumps. That's a very important caveat. What are some of the negative factors or hurdles holding back E15 adoption? Well, there still remains uncertainty about legal liability for misfueling older vehicles. Say someone pulls up to a gas station in their 1994 Buick. It's not technically supposed to use E15 based on EPA regs, and that could be a trial lawyer's dream. And so that's still hanging out there. Some auto manufacturers still do not warranty engines for E15 use. Mercedes-Benz, Mazda, and Volvo are the last three. So a lot of progress is made on that front, but there's still some hurdles. And here's the big one that everybody's talking about these days. The 1 pound RVP waiver for the summer driving season has not yet been made permanent. Basically, this has to do with our Clean Air Act regulations on gasoline. It has to do with the volatility properties of gasoline. In the summer, as gasoline warms up, it becomes more volatile, there's more fumes, and so the gasoline mixture has to adjust to the higher temperatures, and that's what refiners do. If you add more ethanol, that creates problems because ethanol is a relatively volatile blending component. So that's what that issue is all about. E10 has a waiver nationally that allows it to skirt the RVP requirements, but that same waiver has not been granted for E15, and that's what all of the legislative efforts going on are all about at this point. One critical point that, if you only remember one thing from my presentation today, it's this. Even if a permanent 1 pound RVP waiver during the summer for E15 is passed, it only removes one of the hurdles facing E15 adoption. Even more critically, the waiver, as it's kind of called, is not the same thing as a mandate. It only allows E15 to be offered year-round. It does not have to be. And I think that's a key point that I find a lot of people misunderstand. Now we get into probably the most important hurdle after the RVP waiver issue, and it's the fact that current gasoline blend stock, which goes by the abbreviation CBOB, RBOB, and CARBOB, these blend stocks are not optimized for the additional octane in E15. It's critical to understand that the petroleum part of gasoline is actually a complex cocktail of petroleum hydrocarbons that go by the names like naphtha, alkylate, and reformate. And refineries have gone through years of experience and sophisticated mathematical modeling to optimize the different hydrocarbons that are in the 0.9 of a gallon that everybody fills up with in order to maximize their profits. So the whole system has been optimized for, in particular, the octane that's in ethanol. Ethanol is a high octane blend stock, and so refineries now produce what's called an 84 octane blend stock. You spice blend it at terminals with ethanol, and you get a combined blend that has 87 octane, which is the standard for regular gasoline in the US. If you go to E15, basically, and you use the same blend stock cocktails as we're using now, you end up with a 15% ethanol and 85% blend stock that has basically an extra point of octane that the refiners are not getting paid for, because it doesn't. It's 1 point above regular gasoline doesn't do your engines any good, and so it doesn't, at least in theory, have any economic value, and it's just a cost to refiners. And you can imagine that they're resistant to being forced to produce blend stocks that don't optimize their profits. So that's a major, major issue. I summarize that as, I call it the problem of the bobs, the blend stocks. They would all have to be re-optimized for a higher amount of ethanol that's in E15. It's a costly process that is resisted by the refiners. There's another issue, especially during the transition, if we are going to transition from E10 to E15, is that almost all of the gasoline blend stocks, the bobs, are moved around the United States in a pipeline system that can only accommodate so many streams of bobs that they push through the pipelines. There's limitations on tankage that's in a part of that system, and it logistically just wouldn't accommodate. In other words, why not just have a set of blend stocks for E10, then have a set of optimized blend stocks for E15, and just move them all through the system and let the market decide? Well, there just are logistical bottlenecks to doing that. Lastly, if you're going to have a transition period from E10 to E15, where stations are going to offer E10 and E15, then there's a lot of cost at the retail level for adding an additional pump, which is what you have to have for E15. All of these hurdles can be overcome. So I don't want the message to say it's impossible, but it's costly and it would take some time. So when we get back to my first chart that I showed, the question is, what's the most likely path of this blend percentage moving forward? My view is that even with a permanent nationwide RVP summer waiver, I expect relatively slow growth in the US ethanol blend rate from where it is now at 10.5%. A recent FAPRI report from the University of Missouri suggests that we might be able to do 0.25% growth per year in the next few years. I think that's possible, but it seems a bit on the optimistic side to me. But regardless of what the path is, I do think it will be upward. And it's important to remember that each tenth that the ethanol blend rate increases, that raises domestic US ethanol demand by about 130 million gallons. So even small improvements in the blend rate do matter. So now, before I run out of time, I want to talk about exports. The second of the potential responses. Exports are the star of the ethanol sector in recent years. They've been on fire, grown over just a smidgen less than 1 billion gallons since 2021, and topped 2 billion gallons in 2025. So very helpful growth from the export side. And there's lots of optimism about the potential for future growth in exports. One of the biggest targets is Japan, the fifth largest consumer of crude oil in the world. In 2023, Japan consumed 11.8 billion gallons of gasoline, and they last fall announced a goal of 10% ethanol in their gasoline pool, which would represent over a billion gallons of ethanol that they obviously cannot produce. They have infrastructure in place for an E3 blends at the current time, but they imported virtually no ethanol from the US. So this represents as an example of the kind of large opportunity might be out there in the export market. But I would also say that sometimes I think the hype in this area is a bit overdone because Japanese have just announced this as a target and they're not mandating it. So it's not clear exactly how they're going to reach that goal or if they will. I want to dig down and look a little deeper at who is buying all of those ethanol exports. And this chart shows the top 10 countries in terms of growth in US ethanol exports between 2021 and 25. The total is the top bar. And we can see that Canada, our friends up north, represent almost half of the growth in the last 5 years. Netherlands buys a lot. That's probably for transshipment through Rotterdam. United Kingdom is our third largest market, and then a variety of countries that might surprise you below that. So what about the future based on these countries? There's some storm clouds gathering. I'd ask the question, how have our trade relations with Canada been going lately? Not very well. And last fall, the Canadians proposed domestic content regulations for biofuels qualifying for their clean fuel regulation program. And that's actually a direct response to what I want to talk about next, something called 45Z Clean Fuels Production Tax Credit. So anyway, the overall picture is still positive, I think, on future growth potential for U.S. ethanol exports, but there are some storm clouds brewing on the horizon due to some trade issues. So now we want to talk a few minutes about the new 45Z tax credit. A little bit of background on it. Originally passed in the IRA of 2022 to replace the $1 per gallon biodiesel blenders tax credit starting in 2025, scheduled to expire in 2029. Crucially, as we'll see in a minute, it was converted from a blender or a demand side tax credit to a producer or supply side tax credit in the IRA, which means that only domestically produced clean fuels are eligible for this new 45Z tax credit. It also applies to all biofuels, not just biodiesel or renewable diesel, and that now includes ethanol and SAF. The tax credits can be sold in the secondary market if you don't have enough income to use your tax credits. So that's an important feature. And then the IRA version of 45Z was modified in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed last July 2025, and it made several very important changes. One was that only biofuels produced from North American feedstock is eligible starting in 2026. So it's not just domestically produced biofuels. You have to use North American feedstocks. A preferential cap of $1.75 for SAF that was in the original IRA Act was eliminated starting in 2025. And the credits are keyed to a carbon intensity score as determined by something called the GREET model. And the key, a really key change last July was something called the indirect land use charge, or ILUC, was eliminated in determining the CI scores of biofuels starting in 2026. And so here's some representative 45Z tax credit levels that I've derived. A Midwest soybean oil biodiesel plant, around 61 cents per gallon. A renewable diesel plant in California, around 68 cents per gallon. And here we are coming to ethanol. A Midwest corn ethanol plant, by my calculations in 2026, is eligible for 11 cents per gallon, and that's without any carbon sequestration. If you're sequestering, for example, as you might be if you're hooked onto a pipeline, as you can in Nebraska, 53 cents per gallon with 50% CCS, and very close to $1 per gallon, the maximum, if you have 100% carbon sequestration. So the real question I want to focus on here today is the overall impacts for the U.S. corn ethanol industry of that 11 cents. The key is that's 11 cents per gallon pretty much for all ethanol plants in the U.S., and that was triggered by the deletion of the indirect land use charge. So the question is 11 cents a big deal or not? This chart that says, yep, it's a really big deal. These are estimates I've made over the years of the profit of a representative Iowa ethanol plant net of all variable and fixed cost. And as you can see, going all the way back to 2013 or 2007, that's averaged about 13 cents per gallon. And if you're just going to helicopter in 11 cents on top of that, that's not quite a doubling of profit levels from the long-term average. And that is exactly why you're seeing recently, perhaps surprise to many, all sorts of announcements of ethanol companies expanding production capacity at their plants. Now, this is focused probably on the plants that are getting the largest amount of the 45Z tax credit due to carbon sequestration, but it's just a general trend. We haven't seen any large expansion plans, announcements for ethanol plants in quite some time, really, at least for a decade. And the reason is very straightforward. It's 45Z. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of 45Z tax credits in the corn ethanol sector. Well, as I've just shown, the ethanol supply is going to grow as plant capacity expands. We would expect that that capacity will eventually expand enough to return the industry to its long-run average profit rate of around 13 cents per gallon. This will increase the domestic corn ethanol grind. And since the U.S. is an ethanol exporter, the tax credit will shift our export supply curve to the right, and the U.S. will capture a larger share of the global ethanol market. And this is exactly what the Canadians' domestic content regs are designed to blunt. So they actually anticipated this once 45Z was passed. Under economic perfect competition, the 11 cents per gallon tax credit for ethanol will either be bid into a higher price of corn, a lower domestic price of ethanol, a lower export price of ethanol, or all three. Here's a way to think about the range and possible outcomes. If the extra 11 cents is only bid into the price of corn, then ethanol plants would bid 32 cents higher per bushel of corn. If it's only bid into the export price of ethanol, you'd see an 11-cent drop in the export price of ethanol, everything else constant. Reality is probably going to be some mix of these effects. My last point I want to make is respect to SAF. The simple question there is the policy stack of incentives for SAF high enough to incentivize rapid expansion in SAF in the United States? The simple answer is no. Illinois has the most generous credits in the US, and my calculations are still not high enough to make it profitable. My bottom line is I don't see SAF growing rapidly unless it's mandated in the United States. And without a mandate, it's likely to remain a small niche market. So those are my remarks, my presentation, Brad, and I hope we've got some questions and we're going to have an interesting discussion.
Yeah. Scott, we do. We first thank you. Appreciate the discussion and the insight you provide. It's a topic I know you've been focused on for many years, and the insights into the market fundamentals as well as the policy developments here are pretty critical. Scott, if we start with the question, it's sort of a fundamental question back in the beginning. Ethanol seems to be the preferred oxygenated choice, which fits into the reformulated fuel market and brings the E10 blend up to 87 octane. I remember when E10 was the 89 octane because the reformulated fuel was 87 and E10 bumped it up to 89. But the reformulated fuel market did in fact adjust, and they figured out how to refine a lower octane fuel and pipe that and then blend it, and now the blend gets up to 87. Could the E15 blend, if the year-round approval is passed and if acceptance issues are dealt with, could the E15 blend become the oxygenated of choice? Could the refinery market adjust over time to produce something even lower octane so that E15 gets to 87? Do we know what the refinery market sort of where they might settle?
Great question, for which I do not have a firm answer. On one hand, we know that refiners are not going to, just as a general point, be looking forward to losing an additional 5% of their of the gallon of gasoline, especially in a declining market.
Yeah, fighting over market share of a declining market at this point.
Those are always the worst, right?
Yeah.
And so there's that. But on the other hand, there's some really interesting work that especially a petroleum engineer named George Huckstra has done, and some people may have seen some of his work with the RFA. It's really interesting. For a variety of reasons, octane has become even more valuable over time due to the way that, in particular, our sulfur regulations have tamped down on the amount of sulfur in gasoline, and that makes it harder to produce octane, which makes octane even more valuable. So there's some potential for that transition to occur that you're talking about. But even as we go back from that, what you called that 89 to 87 transition, Brad, there's still a big argument among economists and those that work in the biofuels and energy sectors about whether that transition was forced on refiners by the mandates or whether they would have done that anyway because of the volumes of ethanol that were being produced for other reasons. So we've never, as a profession, come to, I would say, a generally acknowledged answer to that question, which makes, okay, um, answering your question clear. It is very clear that if forced to do E15, refiners would re-optimize in a manner that would optimize their profits. The
Hmm.
question is, will they do it voluntarily
You're
if
right.
you
Yeah.
remove the waiver? And I guess the only way to really know is to remove it and find out.
So, Scott, that reminds me, the renewable volume obligations that were first laid out in the 2005 and 2007 acts, that EPA now has the task of setting year to year as part of rulemaking. But those initial obligations help to drive us towards what effectively is a 10+% blending rate. But at the same time, the refiners were also forced to leave MTBE behind
Mhm.
as their oxygenate blend. So so yes, they had both economic reasons to adopt. At the same time, they had policy mandates to adopt. Uh, those are big questions about what E15 has potential, but as you described, it's not a guarantee, right?
Right. That's a great way to put it. The way I like to think about it, Brad, is that the ethanol boom has many fathers, not just one.
Mhm.
As you mentioned, that uh, I really think that that boom was caused by a combination of factors: high crude oil prices. We had the VTEC tax credit at that time, and we had the MTBE bans. And
Mhm.
I think those are actually the three biggest reasons for why we built all the ethanol plants in the first place. The RFS mandates certainly played a role in putting a floor under the use of ethanol that the refiners could see. But my own view is that was probably secondary compared to these other. But it really did take all of these factors to drive the first ethanol boom.
Exactly.
And uh, the question, Mike, I'm, I I don't think we have all of those same factors lined up for an E15 transition like we did, say, in the
Yeah.
early 2000s. That's the way
Yeah.
it looks to me. And that's
I'm,
why I come out and say we're looking at probably continued growth in E15, but maybe at a little faster rate than we have been.
yeah. So Scott, another question about the blend, in fact. So we do see E15 at the pumps here in Nebraska, and I know elsewhere. Um, some pumps, not every station, probably not a majority of stations yet,
Right.
but many. It's labeled E15. It's sometimes labeled U88 because it it markets itself as that higher octane blend. Um, but but it's also, as I noted, limited. It's not everywhere. You
Mhm.
described some of the limitations to it being adopted everywhere. So, short of the refining industry completely readjusting their blend and the reformulated fuel market, uh, E15 depends on additional pumps or flex pumps at the marketplace. Uh, do we expect the industry to adopt more flex pumps? Or, as one of our questions noted, uh, should producers take the initiative and build some stations of their own, kind of like the cooperative movement
Right.
born for the gas station industry.
Well, I think that you have had, um, you know, the 88 marketing campaign is an example of efforts. The USDA has had various incentive programs over the years for flex fuel pumps, maybe not very widespread. Uh, Maybe something like that would have value as a demonstration effect, particularly in large urban areas. So I don't dismiss it, but I think you also don't want to dismiss how expensive that is per station,
Yeah,
hundreds of
yeah,
thousands of dollars. So you'd have to have deep pockets to do that.
right. And my experience at least would be I know of stations. There is an E85 pump. There is an E15 pump. There's there's an E85 pump that has its own separate sort of handle, nozzle, and
Yep,
ring. And then there is an E15 and an E10 and an E0 pump or button for the same pump. Um, so I have not yet seen a flex pump where you choose your menu, but effectively it's adding an additional tank, or at least adding an
right.
additional nozzle. So, all right. So challenges there. You also described the role of the 45Z and frankly the RIN market itself. A question I posed to you as we were prepping for this: if E15 allows additional growth of ethanol production and marketing, does that produce a bigger supply of RINs, which makes compliance with the RFS easier and cheaper going forward? Or how does the RIN market affect the potential here as well? And that's a whole hour to discuss what the RIN
Yeah.
market is and how it
In
works. But
short,
in short,
it could make the RFS dramatically less costly, but not in the way that it's typically understood. The reason is because of what I call the conventional gap, where you have the US, the conventional mandate, what we would consider as the ethanol mandates, 15 billion gallons, but we can only consume about 13 and a half or 13 billion gallons of ethanol in E10. And so there's this gap between the mandate up here at 15 billion gallons and something down here, 13 and a half. And we can't produce RINs, these 6 ethanol RINs to fill that gap. And so for many years now, that gap has been filled with D4 biodiesel RINs. And that means, the way the economics works, that in essence, a D6 RIN gets priced as a D4 RIN. And that's just gobbledygook. But the key is it's not just technical. Because of the competitiveness of ethanol as an octane additive for gasoline, up to at least the E10 blend wall, the price of a D6 RIN would be just a few cents. But biodiesel or renewable diesel are very expensive to produce relative to petroleum diesel. So D4 RIN has a really high price, RIN price, kind of organically, let's put it that way. Whereas a D6 RIN, organically, based on ethanol fundamentals, it's just a few cents. So for really since 2013, D6 ethanol RINs are essentially traded at the price of a very expensive D4 RIN.
mm,
That means that just explodes the cost of complying with the RFS, because all the D6 RINs that you have to turn in for compliance are valued based on the kind of expensive economics of biodiesel.
yeah,
And so if you did have enough E15 to generate every year enough D6 RINs to get to that 15 billion gallons, my estimates are that the overall total cost of complying with the RFS, the RIN tax that the refiners complain about, might drop as much as 2/3.
hmm
So it could be, from that perspective, expansion of E15 would go a long ways to lowering the overall cost of the RFS. It wouldn't
yeah.
change anything about the cost of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and cellulosic being very high. But those are actually pretty small parts of the overall mandate compared to ethanol.
But it might change the economic incentive to produce some of those. in order to generate RINs that are then,
Well, that's always been a little bit of
right?
a
Yeah,
puzzle,
yeah.
is why hasn't it been in the self-interest of refiners to make more E15 so that
So they
they
don't
didn't
have to
have to
buy
buy
the
they
diesels.
didn't have to buy or make
Yeah,
D4 biodiesel RINs to meet their mandates. That
right.
has been a bit of a puzzle to me. You have to accept over this much time that the benefits of that have not yet offset the costs
Yeah.
of the higher D4 RINs on everything.
So, so Scott, to close out our discussion, I have one more question for you from our audience, and it's another existential question. If fighting over market share of a declining market is not enough of an existential question to start with, here's one to finish with. Uh, the administration's recent move to rescind the endangerment finding
Mm-hmm.
that EPA used uh, to rationalize its regulation of greenhouse gases. Uh, the administration's recent move to rescind that finding calls into question what is the rationale or what's the legal authority for regulating greenhouse gases and thus incentivizing reduced greenhouse gas fuels going forward, recognizing that rescission
No,
itself is
and
likely
clearly,
subject
Brad,
to a court test and so forth. But
but as a general statement, that would kind of reduce the wind behind the sails in general for
yeah,
biofuels, but it would actually have nothing to do with the renewable fuel standard mandates. That's a separate law that does not depend legally on the endangerment finding. Now, maybe some smart lawyer someplace, somewhere, might try to challenge the RFS without the endangerment finding. But it's important to remember that the endangerment finding only came into effect in
yeah,
2009,
yeah,
well after the RFS laws were passed in '05 and '07. So my understanding is that there's no legal interaction between those. I think probably it's more as a political issue of what kind of support for other kinds of policies to continue to push demand for biofuels. For example,
right,
I think where that really hurts is SAF
yeah.
uh, adoption down the line if this continues to be the political trend.
You bet. That sounds like a topic for another day because we've
Well,
hit our hour for today, but certainly I know we could go further into the future direction of policy development here as things continue to unfold. And we haven't even talked about the uncertainty and the sort of the current economic issues
wow.
with global oil markets. Higher oil prices do translate into more profitability at that processor right now. So economic, you talk more long-term picture here, but there are some short-run fundamentals as well. So
Well, if we're not going to be an environment, Brad, of $50 to $60 crude oil, and maybe we're going to be 80 to 100 for a while. Now we don't. I'm not making a prediction. I have no idea. But if we are, that would be the kind of wind behind the sails that was very important in the first ethanol boom, and maybe that's will be something that gives us a needed push on E15 adoption.
you bet. Understood. All right. Well, with that, we have hit our time, and we greatly enjoyed, or at least I know I did, and I'm pretty sure our audience did too. Greatly enjoyed the chance to dig deeper into ethanol and the market and policy developments. We want to thank you all for joining us for another webinar in our Center for Ag Profitability webinar series. You can find a recording of this webinar later today in our archive version of the webinars. You can find a lot of other information again on farm and ranch and management tools and information and resources all on our website at cap.unl.edu. I would also note this is our second week in a row of talking about bioenergy. Scott Irwin today has provided expertise on the ethanol market and the implications for maybe for corn demand going forward. Scott Gerlt from the American Soybean Association spoke with us last week about the biomass-based diesel market and some of those same questions about what policy versus economic drivers are fundamentally at play. That recording, that archive recording is already up online. Today's recording will be up there soon. So we thank you for the time. When you exit Zoom today, as always, you're going to get our little usual short survey. We are eager to get your information. That's feedback on how today's webinar went, as well as ideas about what would be valuable to discuss in the future. We truly value your feedback and your input. It helps us to document what we're doing and to demonstrate the impact of it, and it helps us fundamentally to design more going forward. So with that being said, my last word, Scott, is thank you very much for the time. Thank you for your expertise and your willingness to be part of our webinar series here today. I know you do a webinar series at Illinois too as part of the FarmDoc information website. And so I will give you one last word to express your greetings. And if you want to make a sales pitch for the FarmDoc site, I can't refuse you that either. So,
Well, if you want to know, what I'm thinking about in biofuels, make sure you follow the FarmDoc Daily website. That's where most of my research on biofuels is posted, including ethanol, RFS, RVOs, and all of that kind of stuff. So thank you. I really enjoyed doing this, and I really appreciated working with you, my old friend.
I'm glad to do so, Scott. It's been about 3 decades of friendship and work, which means we predate the whole biofuels. So we've seen it from beginning to current. So with that, thank you very much for the time. Thank you to everyone that joined in. We look forward to seeing you next time on one of our future Center for Ag Profitability webinars.